Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping into a collection of texts that, well, many of you probably feel you know pretty well, the New Testament. But what if there are layers of history, scholarship, maybe even some surprising insights hiding there, just waiting?
Yeah, I think that's likely.
I have a feeling we're about to find out.
That's absolutely right. We've pulled together, a whole stack of sources today, everything from serious historical analyses to detailed theological commentaries.
Okay.
And the idea is to explore the New Testament, not just as like a sacred book people revere, but as a fascinating product of its specific time and place.
Right.
It was shaped by different hands, different people, interpreted through centuries of, frankly, intense debate, and it continues to challenge us.
So our mission today is to give you that kind of aha moment, help you get a quick but still pretty thorough handle on what's really key in all this material.
Exactly.
We'll look at how it actually came together, who the key figures were, and importantly, how people have understood it, even right up to today.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's unpack this idea, the New Testament as a historical and literary work. Because like I said, we often just think of it as one book, right?
Yeah.
But it's really a collection.
Absolutely, it's a collection. And the early Christians, interestingly, they've been described as a profoundly textual people.
Textual people. Yeah.
Meaning they relied heavily on written accounts of Jesus and his followers. This wasn't just casual storytelling. It meant a huge amount of effort went into understanding these texts, preserving them, trying to copy them accurately. It was fundamental.
Okay, that word accurately really jumps out.
Right.
Because how, after centuries of copying by hand, surely mistakes creep in, changes get made.
Oh, definitely.
How do scholars even begin to figure out what the original text might have said?
Right. That's exactly where textual criticism comes in. And I know it sounds dry.
Yeah, a little bit.
But it's actually fascinating. Think of it like forensic detective work on ancient documents. Scholars compare thousands of manuscripts, fragments, copies, down to tiny details. And they work with two main ideas. First, intrinsic probability. Meaning, does this sound like something the original author would actually write? Does it fit their style, their vocabulary?
Got it.
And second, transcriptional probability, which is asking, how likely is it that a copyist would have changed it this specific way?
Like a slip of the pen or maybe trying to fix something?
Exactly. Misreading a word, adding a familiar phrase, maybe even correcting what they thought was a theological error. It's meticulous.
Wow.
You had brilliant minds like Richard Bentley back in the 17th century, then Westcott and Hort in the 19th, pouring their lives into this. And today, places like the Institute for Textforschung in Münster, Germany, they're still at the center of this work.
That's incredible dedication. So, okay, these texts are established, copied, studied, but they didn't stay put, right? They spread. What do the sources tell us about how Christianity first expanded beyond its original Jewish roots?
Yeah, it definitely didn't stay put. The book of Acts, for example, gives us a really vivid picture of this expansion. It highlights Antioch as this crucial city. It had the first really strong mixed church Jews and Gentiles together.
Okay, Antioch. Interesting.
And you have Paul, who famously saw himself as the apostle to the Gentiles, to non-Jews. But he was also really skilled at, evangelizing Jews in synagogues first.
Right.
He wasn't just talking to one kind of person. He encountered all these different worldview, what we call philosophies today, like the Epicureans and Stoics. You read about him debating in Athens.
Yeah.
It shows how early Christianity was really engaging with the wider intellectual world, not just hiding away.
So how did the understanding of these texts evolve in those early centuries? It wasn't just about copying, right? People were interpreting, debating.
Oh, absolutely. Big time. During what's called the patristic period, at the time of the early church fathers, you had major figures shaping theology. Well, like Athanasius, who championed what became Orthodox Christology against teachings like those of Arius, who denied Jesus' full divinity. That was a huge fight.
Right, the Arian controversy.
Exactly. Then you had John Chrysostom, famous for his powerful expository preaching, really digging into the text verse by verse.
Okay.
And Origen from Alexandria, he was a pioneer in both text criticism and systematic theology. Though, interestingly, some of his more allegorical interpretations faced criticism later on.
So lots of debate. It wasn't all settled for day one.
Not at all. It shows how dynamic and, frankly, contested early theological development really was.
That makes sense. What about how Christians saw themselves in the world? Living, under Roman rule, but with this other allegiance, this tension.
That's a really key point. The sources consistently emphasize Christians as citizens of two kingdoms.
Two kingdoms.
Yeah, owing allegiance to Caesar, the Roman emperor, and to God. But, and this is crucial, if those loyalties clashed, the ultimate choice had to be God, even if it cost them dearly. And it's important to grasp that the kingdom of God wasn't seen as like a new country on the map.
Right, no borders?
Exactly. It was something Jesus had inaugurated, started, but it wasn't fully finished or consummated yet. That would come later. So they lived in that already but not yet tension.
Okay, that clarifies a lot.
Yeah.
Fast forward a bit. How did the way people interpreted the Bible change over longer periods, say into the Middle Ages and then hitting the Renaissance?
Well, in the Middle Ages, interpretation got quite layered. There was often this idea of 4 levels of meaning.
4?
Yeah. A literal, historical sense, sure. But also an allegorical meaning, a moral lesson for life, and an anagogical sense pointing towards heaven or the end times.
Right. Complex.
Very. Then the Renaissance comes along and bam, you get the ad fontes movement.
At the sources.
Exactly. Back to the original languages. Suddenly there's this explosion of interest in Greek and Hebrew. Latin starts to get pushed aside a bit, at least for deep scholarly work. And this fosters these Christian humanists, think Erasmus. People who were deeply Christian, but also using the new tools of humanistic scholarship to critically re-examine the foundational texts. It was revolutionary.
Okay, let's dive into the Gospels themselves now. Matthew, Mark, Luke, Gracid. They tell many of the same stories, but differently. How do scholars even start to figure out how they relate to each other?
Yes. That's what we call the synoptic problem.
Synoptic meaning?
Meaning seen together. Because Matthew, Mark, and Luke share so much material, you can lay them out side by side and compare them. The problem is explaining the patterns of agreement and disagreement.
Right.
There have been various theories over the centuries, but today the most widely held view, though not the only one, is the two-source hypothesis.
2 sources, Mark being one.
Mark being one, yes. The idea is that Matthew and Luke both used Mark's gospel as a kind of narrative framework.
Okay.
But they also seem to share a lot of material, mostly sayings of Jesus, that isn't in Mark. So scholars propose they both had access to another common source.
Which they call...
They call it Q, from the German word quell, meaning source.
Right.
We don't have a copy of Q, it's hypothetical, but the patterns in Matthew and Luke suggest something like it existed.
Fascinating, like a lost document.
Yeah.
So, with these relationships in mind, how do scholars read the Gospels today? What are the main academic tools they use?
Well, there are several key approaches. One is form criticism.
Form criticism.
Yeah, it tries to identify the original forms or types of material within the Gospels, like miracle stories, parables, sayings, conflict dialogues. And it asks how these might have circulated orally before being written down.
Okay.
Form critics also developed criteria to assess historical likelihood, like the criterion of dissimilarity.
Dissimilarity, what's that?
It suggests that if a saying or story attributed to Jesus is unlike typical Jewish thought of the time, and also unlike the later beliefs of the early church, it's more likely to be authentically from Jesus himself.
Why is that?
Because neither group would have had a reason to invent it. Like Mark 13.32, where Jesus says even he doesn't know the time of the end. That's awkward for later theology, suggesting it's probably genuine.
Ah, I see. Makes sense. What else?
Then there's redaction criticism. This looks at the gospel writers, the evangelists, not just as collectors of traditions, but as actual authors or maybe editors who shaped their material purposefully.
So, looking at how they edited.
Exactly. How did Matthew change Mark? How did Luke arrange his stories? For instance, looking at Luke's edits might reveal his special interest in, say, poverty and wealth, or maybe prayer.
Okay.
But here's a crucial point the sources make. Being theologically motivated doesn't automatically mean being historically inaccurate.
Right. You can select and frame facts without inventing them.
Precisely. Think of a journalist writing a news report. They select quotes, arrange paragraphs, emphasize certain aspects, that's redaction, but hopefully they're still reporting the facts accurately. The evangelist could be doing something similar.
That's a really helpful distinction.
Yeah.
How does this all feed into the quest for the historical Jesus I've heard about? What was that all about?
The quest. Well, for centuries, People generally read the Gospels pretty straightforwardly as history, maybe trying to harmonize the accounts if they seem to differ. But then the Enlightenment happened in the 18th century, bringing this new emphasis on critical thinking and historical methods. People started asking tougher questions, like, can we really take the miracle stories at face value? A key moment was when parts of Herman Samuel Reimarus's work were published after his death, his fragments.
And
He argued pretty radically that the historical Jesus was essentially a failed Jewish revolutionary, and his disciples basically invented the resurrection story to keep the movement going.
Wow, that's a stark contrast.
It was, and it kicked off waves of scholarship trying to sift the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith. Though it's important to say, historical study isn't just about skepticism. It can still yield concrete results. For example, combining clues from the Gospels with Roman history and even astronomical data, most scholars confidently date Jesus' crucifixion to AD 33.
So it's not all tearing down, it's also building understanding within the context.
Exactly. It's about using historical tools rigorously.
Let's zoom in on Mark's gospel then. You mentioned it gained prominence later. What makes it stand out?
Yeah, Mark's story is interesting. For a long time, it was kind of the neglected gospel, seen as maybe just a shorter, rougher version of Matthew.
Yeah.
But in the 19th century, scholars started looking at its simple, direct, almost unpolished Greek style and thought, hang on, maybe this is actually the earliest account. More raw, maybe more factual.
Okay. And the connection to Peter.
Right. There's an early tradition from a writer named Papias, quoting an even earlier source, saying Mark got his information directly from the Apostle Peter's preaching in Rome. Mark acting as Peter's interpreter, essentially.
Interesting. What about when it was written?
That's debated. Some argue for the late 50s AD, maybe while Peter was still alive. Others push it later, into the late 60s, connecting it perhaps to Nero's persecution of Christians after the fire in Rome, or the chaos of the Jewish revolt against Rome.
So different possibilities based on historical context.
Exactly. And then there's the famous messianic secret in Mark,
where Jesus keeps telling people not to reveal who he is.
Yeah, why does he do that? One older theory was that Mark invented this motif to explain why Jesus wasn't widely recognized as Messiah during his lifetime. But nowadays, many scholars think it might actually reflect the complex reality of Jesus' ministry. Maybe he did try to manage expectations or avoid political misunderstandings of what kind of Messiah he was.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something about the ending.
Ah, yes. This is a big one. If you look in most modern Bibles, Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, the part describing resurrection appearances, snake handling, drinking poison, the scholarly consensus is overwhelming. That section was not part of Mark's original gospel. The earliest and best manuscripts stop at verse 8, with the women fleeing the empty tomb in fear.
Wow. So that longer ending was added later.
Added later, yes, probably in the 2nd century, likely because later Christians felt the original ending was too abrupt. But it wasn't by Mark.
That's a huge detail many people probably miss. Okay, so what about Matthew and Luke? How do they compare or build on Mark?
Well, Matthew really emphasizes Jesus as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, the promised king, the Messiah. The kingdom of heaven is a massive theme. Early church tradition is very strong in attributing it to the Apostle Matthew. And there are clues inside, like a story involving a specific temple tax, that suggest to many it was written before AD 70 because the temple was destroyed then, making the tax irrelevant.
Okay, so internal clues suggesting an earlier date. What about Luke?
Luke's gospel is actually the longest single book in the New Testament, and it's paired with the book of Acts, so really volume 1 and volume 2 of the same work.
Right, Luke Acts.
Luke has some of the most famous parables that aren't in the other Gospels: Good Samaritan, Prodigal Son. And he often gives a more detailed account of Jesus' journey towards Jerusalem compared to Mark.
And the author.
The strongest clue comes from Acts. You get these passages where the narrator suddenly switches from they to we.
The we passages.
Exactly, suggesting the author was traveling with Paul at those times. Tradition identifies this author as Luke, mentioned by Paul as a physician and companion.
Makes sense. And the date for Luke Acts.
Again, debated, but a strong argument for dating it in the early 60s AD is what it doesn't say.
Which is?
It doesn't mention the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 or the death of Paul, which likely happened in the mid-60s. Given Luke Acts' focus on Jerusalem and Paul, these seem like massive omissions if the books were written after those events.
Good point. The argument from silence.
Exactly. And we know Luke addressed his work to someone called Theophilus, probably a high-ranking official, maybe a recent convert, and Luke wrote to give him certainty about the things he'd been taught.
Providing an orderly account.
Precisely.
Okay, and then there's John, which, as you said, feels different, very distinct from the other three. Why is that?
John is profoundly distinct. Different style, different structure, different content in many ways. The internal evidence, like references to the disciple whom Jesus loved, points strongly towards the Apostle John, son of Zebedee, as the authority behind it, even if he used an assistant to write.
The beloved disciple.
Right. Now, some modern theories propose really complex stages of writing and editing by a whole community over time.
Okay.
But others argue these reconstructions sometimes ignore the literary unity and the historical clues within the text itself.
So simpler explanations might fit better.
Sometimes, yes. What's fascinating, though, is how John and the Synoptics often seem to complement each other, even without direct copying. For example, John's Gospel gives details about Jesus' early ministry in Judea that help explain things in the Synoptics. Or his account of Peter warming himself in the high priest's courtyard, it adds depth to the denial story in the other Gospels. They mutually reinforce or explain each other, as one source puts it.
Interesting. And what about the theology? John seems much more direct about Jesus being God.
He absolutely is. John has these incredibly high statements like calling Jesus God in the prologue, 1.1, 1.18, and Thomas calling him my Lord and my God, 20.28.
Right.
But importantly, John also stresses Jesus' genuine humanity. He gets tired, thirsty, weeps, and he emphasizes Jesus' subordination to the Father, saying things like, the Father is greater than I.
So it's a nuanced picture.
Very nuanced. It's a high Christology, but it's not simple. And arguably, that same high view of Jesus is present in the Synoptics too, just maybe in seed form, less explicitly stated than in John.
Okay, that gives us a great handle on the Gospels. So what about the rest of the New Testament? The letters, Revelation. Let's start with Paul's letters. They make up a huge chunk, right?
A massive chunk. Paul's letters vary hugely in length too. Romans is the longest, over 7,000 words in Greek. Others, like Philemon, are very short personal notes.
And they have a typical structure.
Usually, yeah. An opening with sender and recipients, a thanksgiving, the main body, then closing greetings, often personal shout-outs, and typically ending with a doxology, a short praise to God.
Okay. Now, I've heard debates about whether Paul actually wrote all the letters attributed to him. What's that about?
Yes, the issue of pseudepigraphy. That's the ancient practice of writing in someone else's name, often a famous figure, to give the work authority.
So did that happen with Paul's letters?
Well, it's debated for some of them, particularly letters like Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, and the pastorals 1 and 2, Timothy and Titus. The arguments often involve differences in vocabulary style or theological emphasis compared to the undisputed letters like Romans or 1 Corinthians. However, the sources we looked at push back on this for the New Testament letters. They argue that the letters themselves make such specific, concrete claims about the author's situation and relationship with the recipients that claiming they were written with an intent to deceive just isn't very credible. It seems more likely that if an apostle's name is on it, they were genuinely involved, perhaps using a secretary and amanuensis, but still involved.
Okay, that's an important counterargument.
Yeah.
So putting the letters together with Acts, how do we reconstruct Paul's own story, his life, his journeys?
Acts is definitely our main narrative framework for Paul's missionary career. His journeys, founding churches, facing opposition. His own letters sometimes fill in details or offer different perspectives. For instance, his visits to Jerusalem mentioned in Galatians. Scholars spend a lot of time trying to precisely align those with the visits described in Acts. It's not always a perfect match.
Right, different perspectives again.
Exactly. We know from Acts he was eventually arrested in Jerusalem, imprisoned in Caesarea for 2 years, appealed to Caesar, and was sent to Rome, surviving a dramatic shipwreck on the way.
And his conversion. The Damascus Road.
Crucial. It seems the essence of his gospel message, salvation through Christ for both Jews and Gentiles, was revealed to him then. But the sources suggest many specifics, like details about Jesus' life or early church teachings, were likely passed on to him later by other apostles, like Peter, when Paul visited him in Jerusalem.
So revelation and tradition working together.
Seems so. And interestingly, Paul's letters themselves preserve even earlier bits of Christian tradition, short hymns or creedal statements that were likely circulating before Paul even wrote. Philippians 2, that famous hymn about Christ emptying himself, probably predates Paul's letter.
Wow. Okay, Paul's theology. Hugely influential, obviously, but also complex. What's one of the biggest debates happening now about how to understand him?
Right now, it's definitely the new perspective on Paul.
The new perspective, what is that?
It's a major reevaluation, championed by scholars like E.P. Sanders, James Dunn, and N.T. Wright, actually. It challenges the traditional way, especially since the Protestant Reformation, that we've understood Paul.
How so?
Traditionally, thinkers like Luther read Paul as primarily arguing against Jewish works righteousness, the idea that people tried to earn salvation by obeying the law. Justification by faith alone was the answer.
Okay, the standard view for many.
Right. But the New Perspective scholars went back and read first-century Jewish texts and said, hold on, that's not really how first-century Judaism worked. They argued Judaism was fundamentally a religion of grace based on God's covenant with Israel.
So Paul wasn't arguing against earning salvation.
Not primarily, according to the New Perspective. They argue Paul's main issue, especially in letters like Galatians and Romans, wasn't about how individuals get saved, but about who is included in God's people now that Christ has come. Specifically, how do Gentiles fit in? Do they need to become Jewish first?
So it's more about community boundaries and Gentile inclusion.
Exactly. It's about covenant identity, not primarily works righteousness. Now, some critics think the New Perspective goes too far and downplays justification by faith. But even its critics generally agree it has forced everyone to take Paul's Jewish background, his Jewish matrix, much more seriously.
Fascinating shift. Let's touch on Romans quickly. What's the core message there?
Romans is Paul's magnum opus in many ways. The central theme is the righteousness of God revealed through faith in Jesus Christ.
Okay.
Paul systematically argues that everyone, Jew and Gentile alike, is trapped by sin and falls short of God's glory. Therefore, salvation can't be earned. It has to be a free gift received through faith.
And who was he writing to?
To the Christian community in Rome, which was clearly a mix of Jewish and Gentile believers, he addresses issues relevant to both, like dietary laws, observing special days, how they should relate to each other. And yeah, the scholarly consensus is strong that the whole letter, all 16 chapters, belongs together.
Okay. What about the Corinthian letters? They sound like they reveal a more hands-on, maybe messy side of Paul's ministry.
Oh, absolutely messy. Corinth was a major port city, vibrant, but also known for its, let's say, moral laxity. And the church there reflected that context.
Problems like?
You name it. Paul addresses deep divisions and factions. I follow Paul. I follow Apollos. Arrogance about spiritual gifts. Lawsuits between believers, sexual immorality, even a case of incest, chaos in worship services, debates about eating meat sacrificed to idols. It was a handful.
Wow. Sounds exhausting.
It clearly was for Paul. We know he wrote them at least 4 letters, but we only have 2, one at the book in Corinthians. He even mentions a previous lost letter in 1 Corinthians.
A lost letter.
Yeah. And then there's a big debate about 2 Corinthians, specifically chapters 10 through 13. The tone shifts so dramatically.
What's so?
Chapters 1 through 9 are generally conciliatory, relieved. But chapters 10 through 13 are fierce, defensive, sarcastic even, as Paul defends his apostleship against rivals who had infiltrated the church.
So what's the debate?
Whether those last chapters are actually part of a different letter, maybe that severe letter Paul mentions he wrote with tears, which got lost, or perhaps just attached here later. Or maybe the situation in Corinth just changed rapidly, prompting the shift in tone within the same letter. It's complex.
Shows the real human drama behind the text. Okay, moving beyond Paul. What about letters like James or 1 Peter? What do we learn there?
James is traditionally attributed to Jesus' brother, who became a leader in the Jerusalem church. There are some scholarly questions, again, about authorship. Is the Greek too good? Is the theology too late? Its most famous section deals with faith and works. James says flatly, faith without works is dead.
Which sounds like it clashes with Paul's justification by faith.
It sounds like it. That's why Luther famously called James an epistle of straw, though he didn't actually remove it from the canon.
So how do people reconcile them?
A common way is to see Paul and James addressing different problems. Paul is arguing against trying to earn salvation by works, especially works of the Jewish law. Faith is how you enter the right relationship. James is arguing against a dead faith that claims belief but shows no evidence in a changed life. Works are the necessary proof of genuine faith.
Different angles on the same reality, perhaps.
Perhaps. Then 1 Peter, strong tradition says the Apostle Peter wrote it, maybe from Rome, Babylon. Again, some scholars question the polished Greek for a Galilean fisherman.
Leading to
Theories that maybe he used an amanuensis, a secretary like Silas, also called Silvanus, who helped shape the language while conveying Peter's message. The letter is written to encourage Christians facing persecution and suffering.
Okay. And finally, the very last book, Revelation. full of strange visions, beasts, numbers. What is going on there?
Revelation is definitely in a class by itself. It's a complex mix of genres. It has elements of prophecy, like Old Testament prophets. It's an apocalypse, a revealing of heavenly secrets and future events, full of symbolic imagery. And it's also framed as a letter to 7 specific churches in Asia Minor.
A unique blend. And the author?
It claims authorship by John, who clearly expects these churches to know who he is. The strong traditional view identifies him as the Apostle John, exiled on the island of Patmos.
Okay.
Interestingly, textually, Revelation is a bit different too. Fewer Greek manuscripts survive compared to, say, the Gospels or Paul's letters. This actually caused problems for early editors like Erasmus. When he was compiling the first printed Greek New Testament, he only had 1 manuscript of Revelation, and it was missing the last few verses.
Seriously, what did he do?
He actually translated those missing verses from the Latin Vulgate back into Greek himself, just to complete the text.
Wow, that's pragmatic. So what's Revelation's main contribution amidst all the symbolism?
Its contribution is profound. It paints this stunning picture of Christ's ultimate glory, his power, his coming judgment on evil, cosmic battles, heavenly worship. But, and this is key, it consistently links Christ's power and glory to his identity as the Lamb that was slain. Everything flows from his sacrificial death on the cross. The victory comes through sacrifice. It's a powerful, paradoxical climax to the New Testament.
What a journey. We've gone from textual criticism to Paul's debates to the visions of Revelation. It really does peel back layers, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. History, literature, theology, they're all woven together.
To bring this together, let's look at a contemporary scholar, N.T. Wright. He wrote a book, How God Became King, focusing specifically on the Gospels. What's his big argument there?
Wright's core argument is that modern readings of the Gospels, especially in many church traditions, have often missed the main point, or at least seriously downplayed it.
Missed the point how?
He critiques what he calls the creedal tradition, the Nicene Creed, Apostles' Creed, for basically jumping straight from Jesus' virgin birth to his suffering and death.
Right, it skips his whole life and ministry, essentially.
Exactly. Wright says the creeds leave out the very thing the Gospels spend most of their time talking about, Jesus' public career, his teachings, his actions.
So what is the main point, according to Wright?
His central thesis is right there in the title. The Gospels are fundamentally about how God became king specifically in and through Jesus, both in his life and in his death. Jesus' actions weren't just random miracles or teachings. They were the climax of Israel's story, the launching of God's reign on earth as in heaven.
So he's saying we've maybe focused too much on going to heaven when you die.
Yeah.
And missed the story of God's kingdom coming here.
Precisely. Wright takes us back to the Old Testament, showing how the hopes and narrative of Israel find their fulfillment in Jesus as the Messiah, the true king, who comes to reclaim God's sovereign rule over creation. And the shocking twist, of course, is how this king establishes his kingdom not through military conquest, but by dying on a Roman cross. That's the paradox.
That's a powerful reframing.
Right.
What are some of the strengths or maybe critiques of Wright's perspective?
Well, a huge strength is how he forces us to read the Gospels as coherent narratives again, deeply rooted in their Jewish context. He really brings the story to life.
Makes sense. Critiques.
One common critique revolves around his idea of a kind of new theocracy. Some argue he might underplay the already not yet tension we talked about earlier.
How so?
They'd say the kingdom has been inaugurated in Jesus, yes, but its full realization, its consummation, is still future. Wright sometimes talks about the kingdom's arrival in ways that critics feel blur that crucial distinction.
Okay.
And for Wright, the application of the cross isn't just about personal forgiveness, though that's included. It's primarily about empowering forgiven people to then go out and confront and address the evils of the world in the light of Christ's victory at Calvary. It's a very world-engaging perspective.
So focusing on the kingdom's impact now.
Yes, very much so.
Wow. What an incredible journey through the New Testament. We've definitely peeled back layers of history, looked at literary structures, waded into some complex theological debates, hopefully seeing these ancient texts with fresh eyes.
Yeah, this deep dive, I think it really shows you that understanding the New Testament involves appreciating its complex origins, the diverse ways it's been interpreted over centuries, and its ongoing relevance, its power to still speak.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And hopefully, armed with this kind of context, you can now approach these foundational texts with maybe a richer, more informed perspective, ready for more of those aha moments on your own.
Definitely. And perhaps it leaves you with something to chew on, In a world that struggles constantly with power, injustice, figuring out what's right, what does it truly mean to understand and even participate in a kingdom that the texts say is both already at hand through Jesus, but also not yet fully realized all around us? What does that look like today?